Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I think that, no, let's go. So that's right. I want to control that. Yeah, I don't know why it's happening because he was on the floor, so it can't be again. Is that time? Yeah. Starts at 10. If that changes, we'll go with it. I'll talk about the fact that we had some questions by the staff. Yeah. Another serious question. No, I don't know whether they can see it in the actual. That's right. Ideally, I want to take off. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar on Practical Guide to Unit Title Subdivisions. My name's Neale Faulkner. For those who don't know me or don't recognise me, because I've got a beard now, a little bit of history. I got licensed or registered in those days in 1989. I've been working with unit titles since 1995. Pretty much full stream every day stuff. I was just doing unit title subdivisions initially. Leaky buildings started happening in Auckland, and I started interrogating unit title plans in terms of boundaries to determine where the boundaries lay with respect to unit property and common property, because that was important for apportionment of costs. So I've looked at lots and lots of different unit titles. I've been involved in the new Act, or 2010 Act, and here I am today, hopefully going to give you a little bit of insight into it. I'm going to start convey my experiences. So I've got quite a bit to go through. What I'm planning to do is to break up the session into sort of have about 6 or 7 breaks every 10 minutes or so on the way through after some specific slides and topics. And I will be looking at the questions that are flying through. I'm not going to answer all of them because I know I've already got about, I think about 8 questions already. And I just won't have time to cover them all off. So the plan is to Maxwell down at Wellington at S+SNZ, he's going to provide me with all the questions, which I will answer every one particularly, and then he'll post that out to all the members, or the participants, sorry. So there'll be a question and answer posting at the end. So my presentation will cover off a few of the questions. I'll try and answer some along the way. But anyway, let's make a start and crack into it because time's marching. So unit title subdivisions, I'm going to start simple and then I'm going to get into some more complicated stuff. So for those of you who are new to unit title subdivisions, I'm going to cover some of the basic concepts. And for those of you who have been involved, those will be pretty simple for you, but we'll start getting into the meat of it pretty quickly. So anyway, unit title subdivisions. What are they? They just generally provide for ownership on a 3-dimensional basis. They're designed for and ideally suited to multiple level and comprehensive integrated developments. They're tailored around specific structures or developments, including car parks, no open space units. When I talk about that, I mean units that don't have buildings within them. They're not allowed. They establish a body corporate for structured governance, and that's one of the key things about unit title subdivisions as opposed to cross leases, etc., is that you have a structured, regimented sort of governance, and it's all backed up by legislation. Enable separate uses to be isolated, so you can start getting into larger developments and layered developments. We'll talk about those later, but they enable a large-scale development that's maybe got residential, retail, commercial, all of that. You can separate those out within the overall umbrella unit title subdivision, but we'll get into that in a little bit. And it allows for staging and redevelopment of units and common property, so you can make changes along the way, although those are a little bit difficult to do, but they can be achieved. So some basic principles. Unit title subdivisions, as I said before, they're the subdivisions of land and buildings and the creation of bodies corporate. So they comprise of, every unit title subdivision comprises of principal units, typically labelled on the plan as a PU or a unit, accessory units, as AUs typically on the plan, common property, and the only other one is future development units. So every unit title subdivision comprises of those first three, principal, accessory, and common, and if you're doing a staged development, future development units. So what's a principal unit? It's the primary unit of residence or business or any other use. It must comprise a building or be part of a building. It can also be a car park. So you can have principal unit car parking spaces that don't have any buildings in them. Accessory units, they're units designed for use in conjunction with the principal unit, e.g. a car park, a garage, storage, passageway, etc. And you have common property. Common property is all the space that is not contained in a principal unit, an accessory unit, or an FDU. And the body corporate owns the common property, an important situation. Unit owners have the beneficial use and ownership of the common property, but the body corporate actually owns it. The body corporate is responsible for the building structures and the infrastructure irrespective of ownership. So first cab off the rank when it comes to repairs and maintenance is the body corporate has to sort it out, and then it deals with the owners in terms of recovery of costs. Future development units, they are units or a unit or units and space that are yet to be developed. So you can have multiple FDUs in a staged development, or you can have just one big FDU for the balance of the development and then just keep chipping away at it as you go. So some definitions. Body corporate, governance entity comprising of all the owners. Base land is the fee simple estate that you start with, the commencing underlying parcel of land. Ownership interest is used to be called the unit entitlement. Ownership interest is the relative value of a unit with respect to the entire development. A utility interest is by default it's the same as the ownership interest, but the utility interest can be changed to a different figure, and it is the percentage used for the apportionment of body corporate costs. The reason that you can have different ownership and utility interests is that in a large development, there may be facilities within that development that are not applicable to all of the unit owners in the development, so they don't share in those costs necessarily. So hence a depreciated or lessened maybe utility interest than what the ownership interest, or maybe greater. Incidental rights. This was one of the questions that I had before the webinar began. Incidental rights is a wonderful one of the sort of bonuses of unit title subdivisions. It's under section 73, and it basically says that in a unit title development, basically what it means is that you don't have to create easements or anything for any sort of support or services or access or overhanging eaves and all of those sorts of things, as you would in a fee simple one. They're all covered under the incidental rights provision in the Unit Titles Act. So in other words, it can keep the unit title subdivision or the subdivision itself quite simple, as opposed to a fee simple situation. If you were doing a fee simple scenario, you'd potentially be creating lots of structural support easements, services easements, easements for overhanging eaves, access, all that sort of stuff. All of that stuff is automatically covered under the Unit Titles Act. So that's a good bonus. So next up, before we get on to types of unit developments, I might just pause for a moment, have a quick look at some questions, and just answer a few of them if I can. I'm sort of pushing time and keeping an eye on it, so I'll answer a few. I might not answer them all, but I'll answer a few. First, one of the questions, section 80, 126 and 138 relates to costs and maintenance obligations between the body corporate and the owner of a PU as opposed to an AU. Should surveyors be paying more attention to the obligations they leave behind when creating unit boundaries? The answer is yes to that. We're going to cover unit boundaries a bit later in the webinar, but absolutely, you really need to be thinking about where you place your unit boundaries in terms of obligations and costs down the track. Second question, when are services in the walls and floors protected by body corporate rules, and when should they be shown as common area? For example, a services shaft in a multi-story building. As I said before, the incidental rights provisions covers the little pipes and conduit and stuff that comes from one unit through another unit ceiling and then into the main system. So rule of thumb is really if you've got a shaft, a services shaft, that is dedicated for lots of services, then I would be showing it as common property, but I wouldn't be drilling down into lots of detail about trying to create little slithers of common property between the ceiling and the floor above to cover a one-off or two-off sort of power cable or drainage or something like that. Next question. When creating easements in gross over common property in favour of utility companies on a second stage unit development, i.e. PUD and first stage already deposited, what should you show as the servient tenement? Should it be common property? Answer is yes. For stage developments, I'll leave that one. Actually, this is a question about what are the certifications required for stage developments. I'm going to cover that off in my webinar. I think I'll stop at that point. There's some other questions in here, but I'll just stop at that point and move on because time's ticking and I've got plenty to go through. So there's a number of types of unit developments under the Unit Titles Act. We've got a standard unit development, a staged unit development, and that can be proposed, staged, and complete. When you do a staged plan, you do a proposed plan, you do a one or a series of staged plans and a complete plan. Or you can do layered, developments which have subsidiary unit title subdivisions within them. So you have a head plan, a subsidiary plan, and a parent plan. We're going to go into all of these in more detail in a minute. And then you can do redevelopments, i.e. if something changes on site, you do a redevelopment plan. So we're going to cover all of these off, and I'll start by looking at standard unit title subdivisions. Sorry, redevelopments can be simple or complex or standard. A simple one is basically a boundary adjustment between two units and doesn't involve any common property. And a standard, or some people refer to it as complex, is just your stock standard development that redevelopment that includes common property. So you have to show the whole of the development again. But we'll cover that off in a minute. So standard unit development. Whoops, sorry. Here's a standard unit plan example. It's an old one that I did way back in 1996. Not necessarily that great in terms of boundary definition, but there's lots of them around like this, so I throw it in there. This is a stock standard scenario where you have a principal units basically shrink wrapped around the physical residential unit. In this case, you've got accessory units surrounding them, which is their yard areas, and then you've got some common property, which is for driveways, and in this case, in the top left-hand corner, a tennis court. Another standard development, this is a multi-level one. This is the ground floor basement car parking principally. We've got some principal unit car parking spaces, some accessory unit car parking spaces, but a standard development, one off, no staging, etc. That's just further up in the development. So we're starting to move up levels, so we're getting into the tower, etc., etc. And that's just a cross section showing units stacked on top of each other in the tower with sort of penthouse apartments on the top and typical ones in the middle. So in a unit title development, in terms of your boundaries, you can shrink wrap them. In that example that I showed you earlier, is exactly this situation here. Driveway coming down, units on the right-hand side. Units are shrink wrapped around the actual buildings and structures. That's one way of doing it. This is just an example of the upper floor because it changes between the floors. The lower floor is a different shape than the upper floor, but nevertheless, the unit boundaries are shrink wrapped around the physical units themselves. The other option of doing your unit boundaries is the polyhedron approach, as I call it. This development that you're looking at right here, there's 4 units in this development, and this is the unit plan for it. You can see that the units are basically blocks or boxes of space within which the residential unit is contained, and that's detailed by the dotted outline on this particular plan. The advantage of the polyhedron approach is if one of these unit owners wanted to do an extension to their unit out to the side, for example, they could do that and they wouldn't render their title defective. Whereas in the shrink wrap scenario, as soon as you go outside your building envelope, then and add another room or something like that, your title is rendered defective, and you would have to go through a redevelopment process, which is subdivision consent, etc., to update your title. So some advantages to the polyhedron approach over the shrink wrapped approach. Horses for courses, you really just have to, depends on how it is. Like on this polyhedron, for example, these units are side by side, and the polyhedron is probably not a bad idea. Once you start stacking them, then the polyhedron doesn't probably work that well. So before I move on to staged unit developments, I'll just have a look at see if there's any questions. I see there's some for staged developments in terms of certifications. Yep, that's cool. Some of these are going to get answered. Yep, along the way. So I will cover off a lot of the questions that have been asked at the moment. Like I said before, there is going to be a posting of the questions and answers that'll be circulated to you all. So I'll move on with staged unit developments. So staged unit developments are a situation where the person is not going to complete the development in one big fell swoop, and that they're going to build units on a progressive basis. So you have some plans. You have a proposed unit development plan, or a PUD plan as it's commonly referred to. That shows the entire development as a dotted outline. In other words, it's the blueprint for the ultimate complete unit plan. Then you have, so you show those units in dashed line work only. Keep it really simple. Don't do any definition of boundaries on this plan. Leave it as flexible as you can. So you have to show the outline of all of the units, how basically your complete unit plan will look at the end of the day. So be as general as you can and don't get into boundary definition on these PUD plans. So, the other one in terms of PUDs is a thing called a substituted proposed unit development plan. That's when you're partway through your proposed development and there needs to be a change made. You have to substitute your PUD plan for a substituted proposed unit plan to reflect that change and then carry on through the staging process. So a staged unit plan specifically relates to the units that have been developed within a particular stage. And you show the balance of the land or what you're subdividing, your parcel, your base land, as either one big future development unit or a number of future development units, depending on how you want to do it. You could create a number of future development units based on each of the following stages. It might be a 5-stage development, so you might create 5 FDUs. No title gets issued for the FDUs, but the developer can call for a title for an FDU, which can then have interest registered against it, so they could mortgage it, etc., to help finance their development. But you have to show the FDUs on the plan. You have to show the balance area from the staging as an FDU on every stage unit plan. You can't just leave it blank. And then comes the complete plan. This is because you can have a number of staged plans, but you'll get to a complete plan at the end of the day when the last stage is done, and that complete plan effectively supersedes all of the staged plans and the PUD plan. So they disappear, and the complete plan will be the only plan left at the end of the day, which will compose the whole of the development. One of the things I didn't say was on a stage plan, you show that the first stage will obviously be the first 5 units or whatever it is. The second stage plan won't just show stage 2, it'll show stage 1 and 2. And then the third stage plan will show stages 1, 2, and 3, and until you get to the complete unit plan when you've got the whole thing developed. So the complete plan is undertaken at the final stage, and it shows the entire unit development. So here's some examples. This was a 2-stage development, some commercial and residential. This is the PUD plan. By the way, you will get provided with a PDF copy of my PowerPoint presentation, so you can have a look at all of these slides. And if you want to get into these plans in more detail, the DP references are there. They're all approved plans, so you can search them on Land Online. So this is a proposed unit plan, like I said before. All of the units defined with dashed lines, no boundary definition. You will see on the ground floor plan on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side of that, there's 2 easement areas, servient and subject and the pertinent. You need to show those on your PUD plan, all of your stage plans, and your complete plan. So that's an example of a PUD plan, everything dashed. This is the PUD plan again, but cross-section through it, so it's 3 levels, 4 levels in one case, sort of see how it's all working, and a schedule of easements for the pertinent and subject easements. You need to have the schedule, and you have to show the subject easements on your unit plan. You don't have to show the pertinent easements, you just reference them in a schedule, but the subject easements need to be shown on the plan and in the schedule. This is the first stage plan. So the left-hand or western half of the development was being developed first, and the eastern half was developed second. You will see FDU 500 on that plan on the right-hand side of both floor plans. That's the future development unit that comprises the second stage of this development. The first stage plan gets into the detail of your unit boundaries, principal and accessory and common property. That's just an example of defining the, this is the first stage plan again, but an example of defining the accessory units by structure boundaries and dimensions. We'll get into boundary definition in quite some detail in a minute. And there's the cross section through the building for the first stage plan. You can see the FDU 500 in the top right hand corner is structure boundaries defined by the upper limits defined by dimension from the top of the roof, etc. And you'll see on the right hand side in that cross section the unit boundaries are defined and clearly shown as being centre lines of ceilings and floor slabs and walls, etc. There are some notes on the other side that describe unit boundaries as well. And here's the complete plan. So basically it's the same as the PUD, except all of the units are now defined, all of the unit boundaries are now defined, everything's solid lines as opposed to dashed lines, and this is the complete plan, and all the other ones disappear out, and this plan supersedes all of the other ones. One thing to be careful as you go staging through is don't change your definition of your unit boundaries on different stages. So if you're using descriptive words to define your boundaries, don't change the wording as you go, or if you do, make it clear that a particular definition relates to, say, the first stage units and a different definition relates to the second stage. So I might just have a quick look at some questions on stage unit developments. Just give me a moment. One question, how flexible can the PUD plan be compared to the stage plan? At which point will LINZ requisition a stage plan because of differences to a staged plan? Our experience has been that LINZ are quite pedantic about this. When I said before you do dashed lines, that provides you with a little bit of flexibility. But essentially in an overlay environment, if you overlaid your stage plan onto your PUD plan, they need to line up. If they don't, you're in the redevelopment scenario, which we'll start talking about now. So in essence, the answer to that question is they need to be basically pretty much exactly the same. Question about shrink wraps. When measuring up buildings for the shrink wrap approach and thinking about you will present the shape of the units on the plan, at what level do you use a rule of thumb for those measurements, e.g. slab level or 1 metre above? I'll go into that in a little bit actually in the unit boundary stuff. So I'm just sort of skimming through some of these questions. Some of them I'm going to cover later on. So if you can just hang fire, probably some of these will be answered. But like I said before, I will be answering every question as I go. Right, so let's move on. Redevelopments. There are simple redevelopments and there are standard, or sometimes people refer to them as complex. We've done a simple redevelopment, but the rules relating to around simple redevelopments are very strict, and so they're very limited in what you can, where they apply. So you can't have any common property, involved in a simple redevelopment. It's basically a boundary adjustment between two units. That's rule number one. As soon as you introduce common property into the equation, and you've got to think three-dimensionally here as well, it'll fall out of the realm of simple and become standard or complex. So are limited to adjustment of unit boundaries only, and there can't be any increase or decrease in the number of units, so simply an adjustment. And you can draw a simple plan that affects only the units that are having the adjustment made. You don't have to draw the whole unit plan again as you do in a standard or complex redevelopment plan. One of the other tricks in this too is that For a simple redevelopment, the ownership interests cannot change as a sum from what they were before. So for example, if one of the units in this boundary adjustment had a ownership interest of 100 and the other one had one of 120 out of 1,000 in the entire development, then all you can do, you've got a total of 220 to play with, and the only thing the valuer can do is adjust. So the sum of the total at the end with the boundary adjustment has to be the sum of the total at the start. And the unit ownership interest is a value-based thing. So the theory is, let's just say decided to swap over a bedroom. So there were two side-by-side 3-bedroom apartments. One became a 4-bedder and the other became a 2-bedder. The valuation of a 2-bedroom and a 4-bedroom might be different as a sum than the valuation of the 2 3-bedrooms together. So just be mindful that you also need to consider the ownership interest assessment as well, because that can trip you out of the simple redevelopment. So generally speaking, if you're doing any adjustments, you're going to fall into the standard or complex, some people call it, redevelopment, but it's just basically a standard redevelopment. So that includes common property and units. If you're having an increase or decrease or change a number of units, it's a standard redevelopment. It requires a reassessment of the ownership interest, then it's a standard redevelopment. So pretty much everything's a standard. So here's a standard unit plan, and on the next slides are going to show you a redevelopment that was done in terms of the retail units, which are on the right-hand side of this fronting Library Lane. You'll see in the sort of the northern right-hand side, there's PU 321R, and then below it there's 322R, and then down in the southeastern corner there's 323R. What's going to happen is that they wanted to split up 321 and 323 into 2. So a redevelopment plan occurred. It wasn't a simple one because we're increasing the number of units. So basically what happened was that 321 in the top northeastern corner got split into 2, 324 and 325, and the bottom one got split into 2, 328 and 329, and the middle one just stayed the same. So the redevelopment plan, that was all that was happening in the change in this redevelopment. So the whole unit plan gets redrawn and those units, new units, get added. So that's an example of one. This is one of the very few simple redevelopment plans that we did. And you can see basically it was a boundary adjustment between PUs 101B and 101C. This is a tower. This is the 10th floor of the tower. And how this occurred was that the owners, the developer, when they were selling the units, these were two side-by-side 2-bedroom units. One person in the sales process decided they would love a 3-bedroom unit. The developer agreed to it. So they moved one of the bedrooms so it was within one of the units and subtracted it out of the other one, hence this. The reason that the ownership interest didn't change is that the valuer had actually done the original ownership interest assessment based on what you see here and not what we'd shown on the original unit plan. So in fact, the original unit plan, we had shown these two units in a different configuration as they were originally proposed. We didn't pick it up in our site visit and as-built measure up, unfortunately. So luckily we're able to remedy the situation by doing a simple redevelopment plan, but it's one of the few that I've come across that has actually worked. So, but an example of one. So redevelopments during a staged development, you can do a redevelopment. So you're partway through your staged development, based on market demands, the developer decides he wants to change the configuration of the units, make them bigger, smaller, less, more, whatever, or there's been some changes to the units that are about to be developed as well. So you have to go through a redevelopment process while you're in the middle of doing the staging. So what you've got to do is get a replacement subdivision consent from council. I'll go into the consenting bits later on. But you have to produce what they call a SPUD, or a substituted proposed unit plan. That reflects the amended development proposal, i.e. amended configuration. And then you continue with your staging plans as you normally would, in accordance with the now SPUD, and then you come to a complete plan, etc. at the end of the day. Consents required for a redevelopment. You need body corporate approval and resolutions, because you've got to remember that everyone's bought into this development assuming it's going to be X and it's going to be changed to Y. So they have to approve that and issue appropriate resolutions from the body corporate. You need a subdivision consent from the TA because you're changing the configuration of the units. And you need all the certifications associated therewith, which I'm going to go through a little bit later on. Oh, I've noted them here. Section 223 relating to your subdivision consent, 224C for conditions compliance, 224F for fire compliance, 32(2A) of the Unit Titles Act in relation to the definition of units, and 25(5), which says that in a staged development it's consistent with the PUD or the SPUD plan. I'll go through those in a little bit later on. So, and you have to do a reassessment of the ownership and utility interests by the valuer, because of course you're changing your units, you're changing their configurations, so their relative values are going to start changing. So a reassessment needs to be done. And of course there's a whole lot, your typical legals need to happen as well. So before I get on to layered developments, I'll try and answer another couple of questions maybe. Do simple redevelopments require subdivision consent? Yes. There's no change, but no difference between simple and complex. They both require the same consenting process. In terms of body corporate resolutions, it's just a little bit easier, but it's no different from our perspective as surveyors in getting subdivision consents. How do you allocate additional titles to a subsequent stage after the PUD plan has been deposited? Do you need a SPUD? Basically, the answer to that question is yes, you need a SPUD to creating, if you're creating extra units. I think I'll leave it at that and I'll move on because time's ticking. Layered developments. They're designed, the 2010 Act, we basically copied the Australian, the old 72-74 Act, that was mimicked on the Australian example of unit titles over there. They updated their Act over time, we didn't. When we came to do the 2010, we copied what they'd done over there, and one of the things was layered developments. And the idea of layered developments is trying to separate the uses within a large-scale development that has a whole lot of mixed uses within it, retail, office, residential, etc. Can be used for farm parks and large-scale proposals. So that's what it's kind of used for. And layered developments set up essentially subsidiary body corporates. So in other words, the residential component can have its sub body corporate or subsidiary body corporate and deal with all its day-to-day issues, and the commercial can have its one, and whatever else is in the development can have its one. They're all under the umbrella head body corporate, and they all have to follow the rules of the head body corporate, but then they can start creating rules of their own, drilling down, but they can't be contrary to the head body corporate's rules. So they enable multiple governance within a development. So you have a head plan, a parent plan, and subsidiary plans. These are all unit plans, by the way. So the head plan is the first plan off the block. Then once you start drilling down to a subsidiary subdivision, the parent plan is the one immediately ahead of the subsidiary. And then the subsidiary is ultimately the one that is the ultimate unit title subdivision of the detailed one at the end of the day of the residential or the commercial or whatever it is. So here's a diagrammatic example of a layered unit development. We're starting on the top left corner and we're going in an anti-clockwise direction following the arrows. So we start with our base land, which is our fee simple title with a building on it, i.e. the dotted outline. So in this hypothetical example, we might have for argument's sake, we might have one level of retail at ground level fronting the road. We might have 2 levels of commercial immediately above it, and then we might have 2 levels of residential above that. And we want to separate out the retail from the commercial from the residential. So we're heading down the layered unit development. So what we do is we create our first unit title plan, creates the 3 uses, creates principal units for the 3 uses. That's what's demonstrated in the bottom left-hand corner. PU1 for the retail, PU2 for the 2 floors of commercial, and PU3 for the 2 floors of residential, and its associated common property. For example, the common lobby entrance in from the road, and maybe the lifts, etc. So at head level, there's common property relating to the 3 head units, and then what we're going to do is we're going to then break, in this example, principal unit 2, which might be the 2 levels of commercial. We're going to break it in 2 parts. We're going to break it into floor by floor for a start. So bottom right hand corner, we're doing a subsidiary unit title subdivision now of PU2, and we're creating PUs 2A and 2B. They're each of those units are the whole of each of the floors. And then what we could do, this is just an example, is then we grab one of those floors and we break it up into its ultimate commercial office spaces, and that's the top right hand corner, PUs 201 to 208. And it's actually got its own common property, that sort of corridor that you can see that provides access to those units in this example. So it has its own common property which relates to the subsidiary unit title subdivision, but not to the head one. So those people can then just have a body corporate for themselves and deal with their own issues and get on with life and live under the umbrella of the head one, which looks after the building and, you know, the gutsy stuff. And then the subsidiary guys look after their individual units. So that's basically it. Baseland at the start, head unit development for a start, breaking up the separate uses as individual principal units, and then grabbing those separate use principal units and splitting them further down. So here's some example. It's a bit of definition. Head unit plan, that's the subdivision of the baseland, as we said, the first layer. Subsidiary plan is a subdivision of a principal and its associated accessory units, and it can be principal units and accessory units. So if you had 2 side-by-side units, principal units, you could do a subsidiary subdivision of units 1A, 1B, and AUs 4, 5, 6, and 7 that were associated with them. The subsidiary plan defines the principal and accessory units and the common property within the unit you're breaking up. It must show the relationship to all other units within the development on the subsidiary plan. This is essentially having a family tree. You'll see that in the examples coming up. But essentially, you've got to know where you sit within the entire development, where your head is, where your subsidiary from, etc. So you know where you sit in the big picture. And you can stage a subsidiary plan as well. So it can start getting quite complicated. So the parent plan, as I said before, is the unit plan immediately above the subsidiary plan. In other words, it's the plan of the unit that you're then going to further subdivide. So it relates to a subsidiary plan. It defines the units being further subdivided by that plan. And there may be a number of parent plans. There's only ever one head plan, but there may be a number of parents depending on how many subsidiaries you do. And as I said before, we've done a number of these. They can easily become very complex. So you enter into them with a bit of caution, and I'll talk about that in the lessons learned at the end of this webinar. So here's just some examples. This is a hypothetical example of a development. Bottom right-hand corner, there's a pub and bottle store with its associated car park. Top right-hand corner is an apartment building, multi-level. And on the left-hand side are side-by-side townhouses. So you could look at this as a whole and do a layered unit title development, or you could actually fee simple off those separate uses and then do a unit title of each. But in this example, we're going to do it as a layered development. So that's our overall. You can see there's access in from State Highway 17. That's obviously going to be common to everyone. And then sort of upper middle, you can sort of see a basketball court and common area. That's going to be common to the apartments and the townhouses, but of course the bottle store and the pub have nothing to do with it. So if we were to do a layered unit development of this, our head unit plan would be exactly this, creating principal units for each of the uses, 1 for the pub, 2 for the apartments, 3 for the townhouses, and accessory unit 4, which is going to be shared by PUs 2 and 3 and not by 1 for the recreation area, and some common property that's common to all of them, being the access in. And then what we're going to do is get PU3 and do a subsidiary subdivision of that. And this, in this example, I've just shown a hypothetical staged version. So the developer is going to stage his development of the terrace houses. So he's creating principal units 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 7. In this case, I'm using the polyhedron approach to the units. In other words, that's including the units and the yards, and creating FDUs for the other stages. I could just do one big FDU in this example, but just in this example, I've chosen to do FDUs for the separate stages. That's quite often what the developer wants, because then he can isolate each of the stages, he can raise finance against them, call for a title for the FDU, and register an interest against it. Here's an example of a standard unit plan, say a historical one. This is in Auckland, Unit G, top right-hand corner, ground floor. It's got some retail space in it, and then above it there are some residential units, sort of typical scenario. Titles have issued. I'm now the owner of Unit G for argument's sake, and I've got 3 tenants in there, and I want to split those. I want to split my title for Unit G into 3 parts, so I can then on-sell those bits to each of the tenants. So I do a subsidiary unit plan, so I'm effectively grabbing Unit G and breaking it into 3 bits, which is exactly this. Grab Unit G, I break it into PUs 10, 11, and 12, and I get titles for that 10, 11, and 12, and I can sell them to investors or tenants or whatever. And those PUs 10, 11, and 12 have their own body corporate and look after their own life separate from the residential people above. This is another example, a recent example we did of a multi-level building in Auckland City. This development had no basement. It's right opposite Sky City, and so there's no basement parking in this development. It's got retail at ground floor, and it's got residential above it. So, and the retail in this particular case is split because of a common passageway to everybody off Federal Street on the left-hand side. So we've got 2 principal retail units, 1G and 2G. We've got some common property on that ground floor plan, which is common to all of them: rubbish rooms, lobbies, toilets, stuff like that. And then the next story up, we start into the apartments. So the first level has got, we've actually shown the outline of the apartments within PU1A on this, but it is one big principal unit, and here is the cross section. So if you look on the right hand side, you can see PU1G at the bottom, which is some retail space, and then PU1A above it, which is all of the apartments in one big foul swoop. So 3 principal units in this case, 1G, 2G, and principal unit 1A. And then subsidiary subdivision of the retail, for example, we grab principal units 1G and 2G, and we split them into each of their retail components, 1R, 2R, 3R, 4R, 5R. So this is a subsidiary units of principal units 1G and 2G. So that's splitting up 1G and 2G into its ultimate parts. This is the same plan, but going further up, showing that in fact there's no retail associated in the rest of the development. And then this is an example of splitting the apartments into, this is a subsidiary subdivision of Unit 1A, which you remember was the head apartment unit. That's splitting it up into its ultimate components with its own common property and each of the individual principal units. And there again is on the right hand side, you can see the cross section showing the division of all the units on a vertical scale. So Before I move on to the next topic. Question: what are the restrictions when renovating entirely within a single PU? What restrictions would the BC implied rights have? How would it affect the ownership interest? Example, a bedroom being added in place of part of a PU's living area, or the conversion of a commercial PU to residential. The body corporate rules typically, I'm stepping outside my scope of expertise as a surveyor here and heading more into legals, so I've got my Bushman's lawyer's hat on here. But essentially the body corporate rules will dictate what people can do within the common property and also within your principal unit. And the typical body corporate rules will say that you require to have consent for everything that you do, and i.e. building consents and planning approval and all of those sorts of things. But essentially, as long as it's a complying renovation, then you can pretty much do as you like. If you change it to a different use, or if you do improvements that increase the value of the property, so say it was a one bedroom unit and you turned it into one large bedroom unit and you turned it into a 3-bedroom unit, then of course the value of that 3-bedroom unit is going to be greater than the 1-bedroom unit. Then your ownership interest will change, and there is provision in the Act to update your ownership interests on a minimum 3-yearly cycle. So what would happen in this case is that if it hadn't been updated previously, you could do an ownership interest update, get a valuer in and update it to reflect the improved value of the unit. But if one of those had been done within the previous 3 years, you'd actually have to wait till you got to the magical 3-year mark and then do it at that point in time. So that's how you would deal with that. What rights do the head body corporate have when you decide to layer your unit into more subsidiary PUs? They've got heaps of rights. They've got absolute control. It's not as of right that you can do a subsidiary unit title subdivision. You have to get body corporate approval, but remembering that the body corporate can't unreasonably withhold their consent. So at the end of the day, it comes down to those lovely words, unreasonably withhold consent. So if they had a really good reason why they said that you couldn't do a subsidiary subdivision, then it would stack up. But if you ended up in court in front of a judge, he is going to say you're just being malicious or whatever. So the answer to that question is the body corporates do have veto, but they have to exercise their powers reasonably. In your example of layered development with the basketball court, why not make the head plan 2 PUs, commercial versus residential, then a subsidiary plan of the residential into 2 PUs with the basketball court as common property? Yep, you could do that. Like I said, you can slice and dice these developments as you like. The reason that in that example that I split it out that way was that the apartment was a multi-level sort of scenario with its own lift and stuff like that, and the other one, the townhouses, were side by side, so they don't have that so much commonality associated with them. And trying to separate out when it comes to utility interests, i.e. that's the percentage of payment towards body corporate expenses, if you can split those things out, because the unit owner of the townhouse development, he'll be really upset if he has to contribute to replacing the lift in the tower, because he'll say, I never go there, blah, 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 blah. So why should I have to pay for that sort of stuff? Is it right you need to decide if you are doing a layered development from the outset? Sorry, I'll keep reading the question. Does that mean you can't do a layered unit development for a later development? Okay, let's answer the questions as you go. It's probably better that you decide you're going to do a layered development at the commencement, but there's nothing stopping you, like that example of those retail down in that little block of shop. You know, there was I think I had an example of some residential above and a unit below. There's no reason why you can't do a layered development later on. Best if you try and think about it at the beginning, because you can structure it probably in the best way in terms of doing your subdivision. Second part of the question, does that mean you can't do a layered unit development for a later development? No, it doesn't. You can always do one. I talked about it before. You need body corporate approval to do it, but you can head down that track. I.e., you have a finished unit title and then someone wants to change the land use of the lower floor unit and subdivide it further. Again, body corporate approval. Land use change might be something that would be deemed reasonable to withhold consent from, because if you bought into the development as pure residential and then all of a sudden it changes to retail or commercial and then a restaurant or a I don't know, coffee bar or something goes in down the bottom, then there's noxious smells come out and, you know, stuff like that. So people might get upset in those sorts of situations. Okay, moving on, plan and substitution. What's a plan and substitution? It's covered under sections 57 and 59. Basically, you use a plan and substitution when you are either acquiring some land outside the development, the completed development. So let's say, for example, there is a unit titled development. There's a large site next door with some vacant land. The body corporate decide they'd love to have a tennis court. They go to the neighbour. They agree to buy a bit of extra land and bring it into their development so that they can build a tennis court on it for all the unit owners. That's one example of a situation where you might do a plan and substitution. The other one is a situation where you lose land out of your base land, i.e. some road widening, compulsory acquisition of some land for road widening purposes. You're going to lose some land. The plan and substitution is basically reflecting the additional or diminishment of the base land, so that it reflects basically what the new base land is. And the plan and substitution basically does not require any consents from council, because there's a whole lot of things that have to happen before you do a plan and substitution. I'll go into that in a little bit later. But it is basically a plan that gets drawn up that basically shows a fait accompli, and it replaces the existing completed unit plan or standard unit plan, and you basically lodge it at LINZ, and LINZ basically approve it, hopefully without a requisition, and you get to and then that plan basically gets substituted in the title record for the original one. So it, for example, in the tennis court scenario, it shows the greater baseland with the tennis court as common property. So examples, as I said before, road taking, land acquisitions, etc., etc. It's a kind of a complicated process to go through in terms of when land's taken or land's added. Land's added is not so bad, but land taken is quite tricky when you're involving PUs and AUs, but I'll go into that in a little bit. So a plan and substitution can't be used for the transfer of units to common property. This action is a redevelopment. So in a lot of situations, you have to do a redevelopment plan before you do your plan and substitution, because the plan and substitution can only be done when it relates to common property coming in, or land coming in as common property, or land leaving as common property. The only way that land can leave a development is as common property. So if, for example, the road taking incorporated some AU car parks or part of a principal unit, you actually have to do a redevelopment to change those AUs and PUs to common property first, and then do the boundary adjustment, and then do a plan and substitution. So a bit of a process. But anyway, an example of one, I haven't got the picture examples, but we've done one quite recently, and these are the plan references to it. 512, 514 is the fee simple strata subdivision. This is a situation where we're involved with the entire development. They're basically two building towers. We did the first building tower was an existing building that got converted into residential, so we did that. We did a fee simple subdivision to separate the two towers, and then we did a unit title subdivision of the existing building, and then basically when we came to do the unit title subdivision of the new building, it was found that part of that building had been built over the boundary. There were some encroaching elements over the boundary. So basically we had to do a boundary adjustment at fee simple level. So at that situation, we did that 537692 as the boundary adjustment plan. Really important that when you do that boundary adjustment plan, if you're doing this whole thing relating to unit titles, don't show the two adjusted allotments. Show the land that you're actually subdividing and the little portion that you're either cutting off that's going to be amalgamated with the adjoining one, because it's really important in the legal documentation process that the parcel of land that is being exchanged is identified as a separate allotment. So in other words, don't show the little parcel of land that you're exchanging amalgamated with the other lot, with the balance lot or the neighbouring lot, and call that lot 2, for example. Show your separable portion as a separate individual lot, and that 537692 shows that. And then 513194 and 532928 are the plans and substitution. In other words, they include and exclude the parcel of land that's being exchanged in the unit title. So, conversion of existing schemes. This is another one that's not used a lot, but is there and is actually quite beneficial. What this is all about, it relates to existing company leases and cross leases and converting them to a unit title subdivision. So it's an easy pathway to convert a cross lease or a company lease to a unit title subdivision. And it requires 75% resolution of the owners or order of the High Court to achieve it. The principal units that you create on your unit plan must reflect exactly the boundaries of the buildings associated with the occupation licenses or the cross leases. So in other words, you can't use this process to update units that have changed shape or anything like that. It's got to be an exact mimic of what you started with, and can't be used to update existing. And the big thing about this, which makes it attractive, is no subdivision consent is required, because most of these are existing situations, of course. They probably complied on the day. I'm going to show you an example of one that I think was done in about the 1950s. There probably weren't hardly any fire rating requirements in the 50s. And all of a sudden, if they had to go through the normal process of a standard unit development, i.e. converting from cross lease through to, and in this case it was a company lease, but from a company lease through to a unit title, in the old days before the new act and before this provision, is that they would have had to get a subdivision consent. The council would have imposed conditions on them about drainage upgrading, and more particularly they would have slammed them with fire upgrading requirements, because they have to sign, of course, council have to sign a 224F certificate which relates to fire and compliance. So these people would have gone through a massive cost of upgrading, and that would have turned them right off. In this particular case, I think the cost of doing fire upgrading was in about the $600,000 to $700,000 range, and there was only, I don't know, about 15 units in the development, so it wasn't worth it. So along came this provision, no subdivision consent required. Perfect, they can convert to unit titles, don't have to go through the subdivision process, don't get imposed with any conditions of consent, and get into the unit title regime as opposed to their company lease regime that they wanted to get out of. So the only TA certification required is under section 32(2)A, which relates to the definition of units, which relates back to the units must comprise, the principal units must comprise a building or be part of a building or a car park. So that's all council certified. They don't give a subdivision consent. There's no yes, no answer. They're just providing a certificate. And that's all by virtue. It's a little bit convoluted in the Unit Titles Act, but if you want to follow it through, look at section 13, part 2, which talks about the fact that these particular situations are exempt from part 10 of the RMA. So here's an example of one that we did. This is a lease plan. It's got flats written there, but no cross leases were actually issued from this. It was a company lease scenario. Reasonably older plan, can't read the date on it, but dating back a wee whiles. They wanted to get into a unit title scenario for governance purposes, basically. So we did we drew these plans, which are an exact mimic of that plan there, except in a unit title scenario. So that was the ground floor plan, the first floor plan. These boundaries were defined by dimension on that original old plan. So we just copied the dimensions across, because if we start deciding that they related to centers of walls or faces of wall, inside faces or outside faces, you just start tripping yourself up, and potentially it's not exactly the same. So we mimicked it exactly. So our definition of unit boundaries was all by dimension as per the original plan, and also by descriptions, as you can see in those cross sections. So that's an example of one of those scheme conversions. So another break, and a couple more questions that I'll try and answer. Does the Unit Title Act allow for unit title subdivision of a vacant site into 2 principal units still vacant and 2 building platforms for future buildings and common property for access? Yes and no. What you would have to do is you would have to get a resource consent for your 2 buildings. You would get a subdivision consent based on that resource consent, and you would have to build one or both of those buildings before you could start the unit title process. Because remember, one of the certifications required to complete a unit title subdivision is section 32(2)A, which relates to the definition of a unit in the Unit Titles Act, which says it must be a building or comprised in a building or be part of a building. So yes, you can get going, but in terms of getting titles for each of the units, you must have the building in place. Council's opinion on what constitutes a building differs. Auckland City or Auckland Council, because it amalgamated with a whole lot of others, had differing approaches depending on which area you were in. But one of the approaches was, well, we're not going to sign it off until you get your roof framing up. In other words, the building structure's there completed. Other councils have accepted you've got a building consent for the entire building, and you've got to say you've poured your slab or put your floor down. Some councils are happy to let it go at that point in time, but most of them will want framing, particularly roof framing up, before they'll sign off. I think I might move on because I'm just mindful of timing. We've got 25 minutes left and maybe a few questions at the end. So deposit of unit plans. Subdivision, so unit titles are subdivisions in terms of the RMA, therefore TA consent's required, including reference to staging. Really important if you're doing a staged unit title subdivision that in your application to council for resource consent, you say that it is going to be a staged development, and you indicate what the staging is going to be as part of your consent. You need a 223 certificate that goes on the PUD, on the standard unit plan if it's just a complete development, or if it's a staged development on the PUD or the SPUD plan. That's where the 223 sits on those plans. The 224C can be staged or it can be overall, and that's why it's important to let council know when you're making an application that it is proposed to be staged, because then you can have staged conditions. So you can get a 224C certificate for each of your staged plans. If the council structure their consent in such a way that they don't allow for staging, then you have to satisfy all the conditions of consent before you do your first stage, or to complete your first stage of your subdivision, and that may be inappropriate and inapplicable. 224F certificate unfortunately got missed out in the Act, 2010 Act. It should be staged as well, but it's not. So you have to get a 224F certificate on either your standard unit plan or your PUD plan. Some councils really struggle with it on a PUD plan because, of course, the PUD plan doesn't show, it shows the outline of units, but then they say, well, hey, this is a staged development. The guy's got a building consent for the first 5 houses in the stage, and there's another 20 to go. Doesn't have a building consent. How do we know it's going to comply with fire provisions? How can we issue a 224F certificate? The answer to that question is if you read section 224F and then 46.5, it's not 46.4, it's 100 and something of the New Building Act. It says, as far complies or will comply. And the position that councils have taken is they've taken the or will comply, because obviously they're not going to issue a building consent if it's not going to comply with fire. So they're not going to be able to build the building that they want to get a title for anyway. So they use that as their backstop. But some councils really struggle with that. 32.2a certificate. Units are measurable and comply with the definition of a unit in the Unit Titles Act. And your 32.2a goes on your staged plans if you're doing a staged development, or obviously on the standard unit plan if you're doing just a standard development. Section 25.5, that relates to staged developments, and it basically says that your stage is consistent with your PUD or your SPUD. Council provide those certificates, but only relating to staged plans. You've obviously got a valuer certificate in terms of ownership interests, and you've got body corporate resolutions. In terms of the valuer certification, that used to be on the unit plan. We used to provide that on the unit plan and show the unit entitlements as they were in those days. It's a separate document now. It gets lodged by the solicitor who's dealing with the unit title subdivision, and the reason it's a separate document is, as I've mentioned before, you can update your ownership interests on a 3-yearly cycle. So it's not attached to the e-survey data set because that sits there forever in theory, but it is attached to the it's actually registered on the supplementary record sheet of the unit title development, so it can be updated. So you need valuers and body corporate certifications and resolutions to deposit your plan. You obviously need your e-dealing documents. That includes your body corporate roles and blah-de-blah-de-blah. And one thing that the Unit Titles Act prohibits is there's no unit title subdivisions of sub-leasehold interests in land. So if you have an interest in land at fee simple, for example, and you can create a leasehold interest in that land, and that lessee or leasehold owner can then do a unit title subdivision. But if he creates a sub-leasehold lease and sells it on to Mr. A, and he decides he's going to create a sub-leasehold and sells it on to Mr. B, and Mr. B decides to do the development, he can't do a unit title subdivision of that development. It can only happen at the initial leasehold interest level, not the sub-leasehold interest level. This sort of came out of the Auckland scenario because there were some developers who decided they'd be smart and create all these sub-leasehold interests and rack the ground rental up and just sit there and clip the ticket as time went on. But they actually fell over at the end of the day because the ultimate developer of the land, the sub-lessee, couldn't actually do a unit title subdivision, which you needed to do to sell down the development to make the whole thing work. So that all collapsed. So something to be mindful of. What am I up to? Oh, some additional items. So as I mentioned before, the body corporate owns common property. The unit owners have a beneficial use of that common property, but the body corporate owns it. So the body corporate can acquire and dispose of land, and it can grant easements, but it can't do that at subsidiary level. It only happens at the head level for logical reasons. Access lots and easements, they're covered in the Unit Titles Act. Just got to be mindful of if you've got a lot that is accessed from an access lot, that access lot or the share in that access lot actually becomes part of the unit titled development, and you have to show it on your unit plan as common property. Easements, you need, as I said before, you need to show subject and pertinent easements in a schedule on your unit plan, and you must show the subject easements graphically on your unit plans themselves and how they affect the units themselves. Supplementary record sheets, I made mention of that before. The supplementary record sheet is effectively what the fee simple title was. So in other words, the fee simple title, when you do a unit title development, goes into abeyance. It disappears. It gets replaced by the unit titles, one of which is a supplementary record sheet, and the supplementary record sheet registers the interests that relate to the base land generally. So it could be things like electricity easement in favour of the supply authority, those sorts of things. If there are easements that relate to particular units, they get registered on each of the unit titles. But if they relate to the base land, they get registered on the supplementary record sheet, not the individual unit titles. Dealing with encroachments, A lot of time buildings get built over boundaries, typically roads, where you'll end up getting decks, etc., cantilevered out over roads, or canopies or stuff like that. The sort of sledgehammer approach is do a bit of road stopping and get the land back into the unit title development, but it typically won't happen because the council won't do that. So generally what happens is their licenses or leases are entered into between the council and the unit title development owner, and in terms of formalising or legitimising their encroachment scenario. If it's adjoining properties, you can get projection easements over the neighbouring property, and they can either pertain to the particular unit or they can pertain to the baseland if you haven't actually started the development. So, questions time again before we get into Lynn's stuff. Why do you not number the FDU in a layered development? You do. In that example, I just wrote FDU, FDU, FDU. You have to number it, and it has to be unique. One of the things that you have to do, and I'll cover it off in a minute, is every principal unit, accessory unit, and future development unit has to have its own unique number. Just because the prefix is different doesn't cut the mustard. So, for example, you can't have PU 201 and AU 201 and FDU 201. Doesn't work. Each of those numbers at the end have to be unique. So it would have to be PU 201, AU 201A, because you can have number followed by a letter if you wanted to, but you can't have the same number for PUs and AUs. Cross-lease conversions. If the original cross-lease boundary definition does not meet Lynn's current standards for unit title, does this need to be updated, or does Lynn's approve direct copy due to as-is requirements? Well, as we know, some cross-lease covenant area definition is abysmal. It's just a line on a plan. In the old days, Lynn sort of picked up on that over time, and most of them sort of relate to either structures or offsets from building structures. So you would copy that through. But if it was just a line on a plan, I've never done one of those, but I would think that you would need to provide some sort of definition. And as long as it was, it mimicked the original, in other words, let's just say there was a line on the plan midway between the two units on a cross lease, or two flats on a cross lease, and there was a fence put up, but the fence wasn't midway, I don't think you could use that. But if the fence was generally midway between the two buildings, then I think describing it as a fence line or whatever would be okay. Another question, sorry. Does Section 57 plan and substitution need a 32(2)A certificate? No. Remembering, a plan and substitution does not affect any of the units. It's only dealing with the common property. So it doesn't need a 32(2)A certificate. How would you show an encroachment on a unit plan if it's not doing a road stop, and will it legally become part of the unit? Where would the boundary fall? Right, how you show it, I think I've got an example later on down the track, but you actually have to show it on your unit plan specifically, saying building not, and you have to label it along the lines of building not included in unit. So your unit boundary will go up to your baseland boundary or your fee simple title boundary, and that will be the definition of your unit boundary, and then the encroaching portion will not have a title, will not be part of the unit title subdivision, but will be shown on the unit plan itself. Can an AU be jointly owned? Yes, it can. No problem. Half undivided, 1/2 share, whatever. No problem with that. You spoke of a 3-year rule. Can you explain, please? The 3-year rule relates to the time period, the minimum time period between reassessment of ownership interests. That's all the 3-year rule relates to. So it's basically saying that you can't just reassess ownership interests on a daily or any other period of time. You've got to let it settle down for 3 years and then have another go at it. I don't know why 3 was picked or chosen, but I guess it was just thought to be a reasonable amount of time that typically units don't change a lot once they're fully developed. You know, yes, some people might gold plate them and add another bedroom, and you know, if they do that, they do a reassessment anyway because they're doing a redevelopment plan typically if it's shrink wrapped. But where in most situations, they would just have to wait until the 3-year period was up. But a lot of people, I don't know if people are utilising that. I'm not sure because I'm not involved with it. I suspect not, but it just gives the ability. Under the old Act, there was no way of reassessing the ownership interest, which was the old, the unit entitlement, which was the old ownership interest. There was no provision to reassess it. So if you did changes along the way, like improvements within your unit, and all of a sudden you have a gold-plated unit and with 5 bedrooms, and it was all within the building envelope that you started with, but the value of it increased, you couldn't actually change your unit entitlement unless you did basically a redevelopment or whatever. Then you could change it. So this allowed for ownership interest to be updated periodically along the track. Okay, I better move on. Oh, sorry, one other question. What are the capture requirements for an easement over a unit in favour of another unit? Okay, so if you're creating a right-of-way through one unit in favour of another unit, it's an aspatial capture.
No topology.
Yeah, so it's a no topology sort of scenario. So so that's how you deal with it. Anyway, I better move on. We've got a little bit more to go and time's ticking. Lynn's guidelines and rules. They've got a whole lot of good material, Lynn's, and you should make use of it. So the unit title guideline is available online. Type in that and you'll get it. It's really good, really valuable resource. It includes a summary of all the changes from the old Act to the new Act. One of the really good parts of it includes a certification table. So depending on what type of unit title subdivision you're doing, it actually lists what certifications are required, not only for surveyors, but also for legal stuff. And it's currently being updated, I understand, from advice from Lynn. So it's a little bit out of date and there's a couple of little idiosyncrasies in it. So those will be ironed out and it should be even better than it is already, but a really valuable resource. Easements and covenants, I've covered that before. Existing or new ones, they've got to be included in the schedule on the plan, and the subject ones must be spatially defined on your unit plan. Your valuer certificate, as I said before, is now lodged with the e-dealing. It used to be part of the e-survey data set, but because it can be changed on a 3-yearly cycle minimum, then it's an e-dealing and it can be easily changed that way. So it forms part of the supplementary records sheet, as I mentioned before, no longer part of the e-survey data set. And it must include the ownership interest, which, like I said before, is the capital value of the unit relative to the whole development. And it may include different utility interests, and that's the contribution to expenses. So the Act says that if you don't define a utility interest differently, it will be the same as your ownership interest, but you can define it differently. And that's, as I said, the percentage contribution that each unit owner is going to make to the body corporate expenses. Unique unit references. We talked about that just before. That includes principal and accessory units and FDUs. Has to start with a number, can be followed by a letter. Rules for Cadastral Survey 2010. Again, another thing available online for you. There's a depiction of units guide, depiction of unit boundaries. So I've got some examples of that coming up, so we can have a look at that. So specific boundary definition, which we're going to move into, is absolutely imperative. No longer a default option. Leading up to the Cadastral Survey Act, there was default definitions and the various legislation and guidelines, etc., that basically said unless shown otherwise, unit boundaries are the centre lines of walls, floors, ceilings, etc. That no longer exists, so you have to be specific on your unit plan of your unit boundary definition. And the idea is that the lay person, the unit owner or the lawyer or whatever, can pick up the unit plan, look at it, and fully understand where the boundaries of any unit are. Whereas before they couldn't. They were just black lines on a plan, relied on a default definition and some other legislation, and hence I got asked to do all sorts of boundary interpretations and investigations, etc. So specific boundary definition, structure boundaries and reduced levels with PRMs, etc. We talked about the polyhedron versus the shrink-wrapped approach. There's horses for courses on that. Historical transitional definitions, basically if you're dealing with a stage unit development that was still ongoing, that started before the new Act and is now getting completed in the current Act, there is some transitional provisions under the Act that say that you're allowed to use the same methodology as was adopted earlier. In other words, you don't have to adopt the new boundary definition methodology prescribed for a brand new development, and that's Lynn's ruling, blah, 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 if you want to have a look at that. So here's Lynn's depiction of unit boundaries. You can see in these diagrams, you can get a copy of this, I've given you the guidelines to get to it. You can see that it's specifically describing what the unit boundaries are. Midlines of walls. It's also on the right-hand side graphically depicting where they are, either relative to structures or within structures, etc. So that's all available online. I want to get a little bit more into that, and I'm running out of time. So unit boundary definition is important in terms of ownership and the apportionment and recovery of costs. So when it comes particularly to leaky, this is highlighted in the leaky building scenario, it's all about who pays and and where those cost allocations land, basically. So historically, it's been really deficient and relying on that default definition I referred to before, which was all about, at least stated on the unit plan, centre lines of walls, blah, 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 blah. So here's an example of a leaky building scenario in Auckland. This is just a typical unit development. These are side-by-side units. This is the unit plan. I've coloured up on this unit plan where the exterior weatherproofing fabric lies. The green colour is that it lies in common property. The purples are that it lies in unit properties. And the oranges are because the AUs, because the buildings are 3 levels, the AUs have a lower upper height limit than the units. So they lie partly in the adjoining owner's property, the outside face of the building, because these are all centre lines of walls here, by the way. They lie in the neighbour's accessory unit, the outside face. So you can imagine the arguments that ensue from that, and you can imagine what the unit owners think of surveyors when they look at that and think, oh my God, what sort of logic was applied to this? And in fact, there was no logic. That was the problem. No thought put into where the unit boundaries ultimately are going to be and what the effects are. And this is the same one with another example, not bad in terms of definition of the roof line, pretty clear that it's in common property, but the rest of the exterior starts fiddling around within units and not in units and blah, 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 blah. So again, as I said, specific unit boundary definition is imperative. The rules for cadastral survey require unit to be clearly, simply and unambiguously defined on the unit plan. Where should the unit boundaries be located? Centre lines or internal, external face of exterior wall framing and ceilings of roof structure results in common property. There's a real trend towards, I guess it's a trend, of putting the exterior weatherproofing fabric of the building in common property because it makes the administration of it by the body corporate at a later date that much easier. If it's in unit property, then you've got to do work within someone's property, which is a problem. And then, of course, does that unit owner share the cost solely in terms of those repairs, or is it shared amongst others? All of those questions start coming up. There are precedent about that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, if it's all in common property, life becomes a lot easier. So if you had a multi-level development, units stacked on top of each other, I would suggest that you have all of your exterior weatherproofing fabric in common property. If you have a side-by-side development with like a terrace house development with side-by-sides, and they've each got their own independent roofs with party walls between them, etc., then I would be thinking, well, maybe you just make they adopt the polyhedron approach so that the whole of the external of the building weatherproofing is within the unit owner's thing, because then if his building leaks, it doesn't really affect anyone else. He's responsible to fix his own. Body corporate doesn't need to be involved. So so if you're doing the exterior face or beyond, it results in the unit in the structure being within unit property. Thinking that you've got to think about roofs, decks, balconies, and courtyards. They're classics. One of the examples, or one of the classic problems, is that when people are defining upper and lower height limits, they go in and they do an as-built and they do a floor slab level and they drop it 50 millimeters into the floor slab for the lower height limit, but they don't think about the fact that the deck outside steps down 100 mils to comply with the Building Act, and therefore the unit boundary goes screaming through a bit of space immediately above the surface of the deck below, and the deck in a multi-level situation ends up in the unit owner's property below. Just anomalies like that. So you just need to think about those things. Whether the roofs need to be in common property or unit property, like I said, in a terrace house development, I would be putting it within the units. But if there was a common roof, for example, for the development, I'd be putting it into common property. Some examples of unit boundary definition. Probably can't see that very well on here. Look at you can grab this plan out at a later date, or when the slides come out in PDF format, you'll be able to see it. But graphically, you can see where the unit boundaries are, and again on the right-hand side, there's a word description about where they are too. Another example where we've separated out we've tried to put the whole of the exterior fabric of the building in common property, so we've separated out the deck space and terraces from the units themselves as separate AUs with common property between them. Cross sections sort of clearly showing that the roofs are part of common property, and the lifts and all of that sort of stuff. Very quickly, as you all know, the cadastral survey rules are changing. Lynn's has given me a little bit of a heads up. They're in draft format at the moment, but some of the key changes that relate to unit title subdivisions are referred to on here. You can read it for yourself, but some line styles. All new developments must be must be in terms of an official vertical datum, no assumed datum, so that can be NZVD or the local district datum, mean sea level, whatever, Auckland vertical datum, whatever it is. Mandatory requirement to connect to a vertical control mark for boundaries defined by reduced levels. You can read all of that stuff, but that's just giving you a little bit of a heads up on some of the changes that are coming up, but it's only in draft format. There may be other stuff, but I'm sure Lynn's will update LCSs of all of this stuff. Right, finally, some lessons learnt, because we've hit 11:30, we're about to. So second to last slide. In my last 25 odd years of doing unit title subdivisions, here's some of the things that I've learnt. There's heaps, but is a unit title subdivision the best answer, or would a fee simple subdivision be a better form of tenure for the owner? Example, if you've got units stacked on top of each other in a multi-level development, then definitely do a unit title and not a fee simple. If you've got side-by-side units in a terrace house development, consider doing a fee simple subdivision, but be very careful about overhanging eaves and stuff like that, because some of these modern designs don't have party walls that run right through the guts of them and come out the other side, and they're really, really separate. Because of urban design requirements, etc., you might find a situation where there is one unit is proud or in front of another unit partially along the frontage, and so therefore the eave is going to hang over. So then you end up in a fee simple stratum scenario, and that starts getting complicated in terms of maintenance and services and etc. So but there's a real appetite for fee simple as opposed to unit title. I think a lot of people are wanting fee simple just because your home is your castle and you're not involved in a body corporate. But unit titles are a really good form of ownership when there are developments that are integrated, etc. And there's going to be more and more unit title subdivisions around. Auckland City's intensifying The unitary plan rules are all about going up, not out. And if you're going up, then unit title subdivision is the way to go. Wouldn't even consider fee simple, because it just by virtue of easements and all of that stuff, and the incidental rights I talked about in the Unit Titles Act are wonderful. They cover that whole Eve scenario we've just talked about. They cover all the services and all of those sorts of things. Consult early with the client and the lawyer regarding the definition of units and where the building elements are going to be located as a result in terms of boundaries, common property or unit property, because the lawyer is going to be drafting the body corporate rules, and it's really important that they know where these building elements are going to lie so that they can create rules relating to them. Make a conscious decision about where every unit boundary will be located relative to structures, and is that logical? Classic problem was our example in that simple redevelopment. Typically what happens is you start a unit title subdivision by grabbing the or getting hold of the CAD files from the architect. There might be the building consent plans. You draft up your unit title subdivision based on it. Unbeknown to you, the developer decides he's going to add an extra bedroom to one of the prospective purchasers' units. You don't hear anything about it. And unless you do an as-built, a good one at the end of the day, you're not going to pick up on those things necessarily, and then you'll be a big problem because you'll have to go through a redevelopment process, and that's a big issue if it's not anticipated. Layered developments can become overwhelmingly complicated in the eyes of prospective owners and an administrative nightmare. So people are tending to shy away from them a little bit because once you get multiples body corporate, everyone's eyes start glazing over. And also you can imagine if you had a different body corporate company running each of the body corporates, then those people have to liaise and talk about and get together and coordinate their body corp meetings and all of that stuff. So it can become a bit nightmarish. Advise your client that future changes can be accommodated under the Unit Titles Act, but they can be difficult and time consuming to achieve. You might have to get body corporate resolutions down the track, or if you're in a staged development, the unit owners might not agree. Life just can become quite difficult. Last minute changes are problematic. Classic example, developer has a basement car park in a building. It gets consented with 100 car parks, all complying with the reverse manoeuvring requirements, blah, 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 of council. Developer getting near the end of his development decides that, geez, I'm selling these car parks for 30 or 50 grand a pop. They're just lines painted on a bit of concrete. It's an easy way of making some more money. And he wants to start jamming more car parks into spaces that probably shouldn't have a car park or will compromise reverse manoeuvring or some council requirement. It's a classic example. And they'll come to you and say, oh, I want to add 3 more car parks into the development. You've already got your subdivision consent with a particular number of AUs. You want to add more of them. But really be mindful of the fact that do those car parks he wants comply? Because that's the trick. Because at the end of the day, if that car park gets created, a purchaser buys it, he owns a Range Rover and he can't fit in it and he can't maneuver out of it, he'll go back to the body corporate, which will go back to the developer, and the developer will come straight back to you and it'll be your problem. So you need to be really mindful of that. Additions of lockers, etc. That's a classic example of changes happening in the last minute and adding and taking away PUs and stuff like that and AUs. IT walls, that's what that example that I gave. Just as built your unit boundaries before you finalise your plan and lodge the Midlands, just to make sure that what was proposed is what is at the end of the day. So allocation, one of the other ones we've found was the allocation of records of title to PUs only. Pre-allocate them to the PUs, but don't pre-allocate them to the AUs when you're setting your e-survey data set up. The reason for that is that most developers flick and change around AUs. They might say that, yeah, I've sold that car park to that unit owner, but at the end of the day, they typically don't, or if they do, they want to swap them around later on. So if you've allocated the title reference to the AUs as part of your eSurvey data set and it gets approved as to survey that way, it's a real problem later on if those AUs are then to be associated with a different principal unit and therefore a different title. So sort of good rule of thumb is to allocate the title references to the PUs but not to the AUs. So that's it. I've run out of time. I'm over time by 5 minutes, so sorry about that. So further questions, post them. I'm going to answer all of them, and that'll get circulated to everyone that's been listening. And also, are there topics when you're doing that? If there are some topics that weren't covered or you'd like to know more about them, fire them in. And I'm also happy to do a masterclass webinar. I'll just call it masterclass for want of a better term. A follow-up webinar on specific aspects of unit title subdivisions, but based on your feedback. Things like, how do I undertake a redevelopment during a staged unit title subdivision? How do I deal with baseland acquired or taken away? I've given you some examples of that, or maybe some other worked examples. I'm happy to follow up this webinar if you found it useful with another one that goes into some specific elements that I haven't covered or you're unclear about or whatever. So thank you for tuning in, and I hope it's been helpful and I haven't talked for too long. And all good. And if you've got questions about my beard, I'm semi-retired. I made a New Year's resolution. I'd grow some facial hair for a year because I've never done it before. No, my wife doesn't like it very much. Yes, I'm going to hang on to it afterwards probably because I'm going skiing in Japan in February, and it's really good to keep your face warm. And the worst part about having a beard is trying to eat ice cream from a cone. It's pretty messy, and I haven't mastered that yet. Anyway, goodbye, and have a good rest of the day and weekend. Cheers, see you.